welcome to another episode of KCC Revision. My name is Nyongesa Edwin. If you are new to this channel and you want to support us, please feel free to hit on the subscription button, like, comment, share to help our content reach more people. Well, in our episode today, I would like us to look at narratives or oral narratives, which of course belong to the broader oral literature category. It's a genre of literature called oral narratives. Remember, in a nutshell, oral literature has four major categorization. One, oral narratives that we are going to look in this episode, and also we have what we call songs or poems, and then you have what you call the short forms of literature. So our main concern in this lesson, this episode, is to look at oral narratives. We want to do a diagnosis. Is like we are placing oral narratives on a dissecting table, and then we are going to find out what is inside oral narratives. So in terms of examination essentials, oral narratives are examined in two ways. In paper one, they can bring a very short narrative instead of a poem. Now, this year's case, you see, that is 2024, they brought an oral poem. So we are saying that instead of an oral poem, sometimes NEC may decide to test a short oral narrative. But mainly, this kind of question, narrative, is tested in English paper 2, question 3, as an alternative to songs or poetry. So this year's 2024, they brought a song that is a dirge, and maybe next year they always alternate. If it's not a poem, then it's an oral narrative with an alternative being a song. So next year we are projecting that NEC will examine an oral narrative. So again, what is an oral narrative? An oral narrative is a story told by word of mouth. It's also called a tale. A tale. You see, these stories told by the word of mouth, passed from one generation to another, we call them narratives. So, looking at narratives, we need to do a diagnosis such that we want to, if we address narratives in broader terminologies, it will be difficult for you to appreciate and understand uh, what they actually stand for. So, in order for you to appreciate narratives, you have to categorize them into various categories, and these categories are based on the uh, context of situation. So we have 6 or 7 major categories, types of narratives, but of course, not limited to the ones that I'm going to list, including, of course, what we call fables or animal stories. We also have what we call myths, we have what we call legends, we have what we call etiological or explanatory narratives. Even though examiners, I think, they are discouraging explanatory, they are also called why stories. We also have what we call human tales and trickster narrative. Now, I don't know if we still have a category called human tales. Of course, we have had debate where people are saying maybe it should not be considered. And also, before I forget, we also have what we call ogre or monster narratives. So those are the various categorization. And in terms of questions, they can ask you to categorize. So for you to categorize, you need to understand it's based on the content and context of situation. So what is an animal story or a fable? A fable is a story where animals are the main characters. You see animals carrying on activities, behaving like human beings, and what have you. Then we call that actually a fable. So mostly you'll see animals being main characters like hare, like hyena, like the what hog and what have you. All that. So any kind of narrative where animals are seen to be main characters, then we categorize it as an animal story. And in terms of categorization, when they ask you to categorize, you give the category and you say why. For example, you can say this is an animal story because animals are the main characters, and you specifically point out the animal characters that have been used in the given narrative. We also have what we call trickster narrative. Now, trickster narrative is a story where one character plays a trick on another character, where an animal, a clever one, plays a trick on a foolish character. The clever character is actually called the trickster. Then the foolish character is called the dupe. And most of the time, these are actual animal stories. But if you have an animal story with an element of trickery in it, then it ceases to be just an animal story. It becomes a trickster narrative. So if you see an element of trick, if there's trickery in a given narrative, then it's actually a trickster narrative. Because most of the time, these kind of stories help to bring out the idea of strength, body size, and also small animals playing a trick on larger animals. The question of brawn as compared to physical appearance. So you'll come across animals such as hare playing a trick on bigger animals like the elephant and so on. So if you come across a story where an animal plays a trick on another, then it ceases to be just a fable or an animal story. It becomes a trickster narrative. Well, another category is what you call an aetiological or explanatory or a why story or even etiological in some quarters, they have called it that way. So these are kind of story where the kind of stories that explain the origin of natural phenomena, but simple day-to-day concepts. They are called why because they tell us how some things came into existence. The simple concepts that we experience on the day-to-day basis. For example, why do the hyenas limp? Why is the back of the tortoise cracked? Why do the zebras, and not zebras, some friends call it, so why do zebras have black and white strips? And so many others, why do dogs bark? Why do hawks actually eat chicks and what have you? So all those stories, they are simple concepts. They are not complicated. So we call it actually an aetiological or a why story. It is related, or there is a kind of relation between myths and an aetiological, but there's a difference. So our next category is actually a myth. A myth is a kind of story where that myths explain the origin of natural phenomena, but they deal with serious issues. Etiological stories deal with day-to-day concepts, simple concepts, but myths will deal with maybe serious issues, and they are also religious in nature. So they have religious aspects in them. So they are religious in nature. So we call them myths. They explain the origin of serious things like origin of death. Why do human beings die? And they are also religious in nature, so they have gods and goddesses and ancestral spirits and any form of worship. So they are called myths, and that's the difference between a myth and an ethological narrative. We also have what we call monster or ogre narratives. Monster or ogre narratives are stories about supernatural creatures. Creatures with supernatural powers are called ogres or monsters. They that have ability to transform themselves. They are big, they are huge, they are scary, and so on. So every time you come across such beings with supernatural abilities, then it's actually a monster or an ogre narrative. We also have what you call legends, and legends are stories about heroes and heroines and their achievement in the society. So any form of achievement, and most of the time, legends are actually historical figures. You can trace them to a given community. They achieve something maybe during war, during calamities such as floods and what have you, and they achieve something that is extraordinary, and we have said that these legends are actually historical figures. For example, we can have the legend of Rwanda Magere, we can have the legend of Gor Mahia, we can have the legend of Elijah Masinde, and what have you. So all these are what we actually call legends. Then lastly, we also have dilemma. Dilemma, you'll tell me in the comment section below if we can still include human tales as part of types of narratives. but we also have what we call a dilemma narrative. These are kind of narrative where characters in the given narrative are left with more than one option to pick from, and every option is not an easy one, so they are left at crossroads. They don't know which option to pick. We call that actually a dilemma. So, dear viewer, in a nutshell, that's actually the categorization of oral narratives. So it's important that you go through these categories and you know how to place them correctly or categorize them correctly. Well, after looking at categories, it's also important that you look at features of narratives. What makes them to be narratives? So it's important that you look at features of narratives. And I want to clear the air. There's a difference between features of narratives and styling narratives. So features of narratives are like opening formula phrases used to introduce a given narrative. Once upon a time, in the distant past, long, long ago, all that. So it's called an opening formula. And an opening formula, of course, helps in taking the audience from the real world to the world of imagination or the make believe world. So it's called an opening formula. And then a closing formula is a phrase that brings the narration to the end. And phrases that mark the end of a narrative include, that's the end of my story. They lived happily thereafter, all that. So it's called closing formula. And a closing formula helps to bring back the audience to the real world. So it takes the audience from the world of imagination back to the real world. It also signifies the end of the narration. It signifies the entry of the next narrator and what have you. So features of narratives, others will include timelessness, that these kind of stories do not have a time frame. They don't address a given time in history of mankind. We don't say that in 1980 here and hyena. No, we don't begin like that. We say once upon a time. So that is timelessness. By virtue of not having a specific time frame attached to these stories, it makes it timeless. So timelessness is another feature of narratives. We also have what we call personification, where we give human attributes to inanimate things and animals, where we see animals talking, animals holding parties, animals doing human activities, is actually called personification. Another feature of narratives is element of fantasy. Element of fantasy. Fantasy is anything that touches that lacks the realm or that lacks reality, something that cannot happen in real world situation, is based more on imagination, such as animals talking, the idea of ogres and monsters and what have you. All that actually points towards what we call fantasy, so element of fantasy. So those are features of narratives in a given um, story or tale. So again, when you are asked to identify and illustrate, remember in literature, identification must always be followed by illustration. You say timelessness, and then you say why. You say there's use of personification, and you qualify your answer. You don't just say personification and you don't actually qualify, and so on. So those are features of narratives, features that cut across the narratives. And then the last bit on narratives is actually what we call the socioeconomic and political landscape or aspects in a given narrative. So when we are talking about political aspects, we are talking about the way people rule themselves, the way people rule themselves. So who is their custodian? Who is in charge in terms of leadership? So if it's a political aspect, you'll say if there's a chief, then it's chieftaincy. Chieftaincy. So you don't say there's a chief. You say political aspect, chieftaincy. You can if there's a queen, maybe there's a monarch. Monarch. If there's elders, then a council of elders, and so on. So any form of leadership is actually what you call political, how people rule themselves and the rules that govern the ethos and conduct of the society in terms of the leadership, whom do we attribute in terms of the hierarchy, the highest form of hierarchy. So we call that actually political aspects. Economic aspect is the way people earn their livelihood. How do they earn their livelihood? And you have to peruse through the narrative for you to come across hints. If there is mention a hoe or a djembe, then you know there's actually cultivation. So if they ask you to give an activity, you don't say cultivators, you say cultivation. You don't say farmers, you say farming as an activity. If there's honey, then maybe bee keeping and not beekeepers. So you have to be very, very careful. If there's a pot, then there's pottery. If there is maybe a basket, then there's basketry. So you have to be very careful with the way you deal with this kind of question, economic activity. And remember, we have said you must give an activity. You must give an activity. So don't say beekeepers, say beekeeping as an activity. So you look for hints in the given narrative for you to score. And then social aspects will include a way of worship and culture of a people. So you do they have ancestors? Do they own a poor libation in terms of friendship, in terms of marriage, in terms of rites of passage, death, celebrating of newborns, courtship, and what have you? All that is actually what we call, in fact, even games, like games and what have you, all that is actually social. So if they ask you on social, political, and economic landscape, then you are in a better place to respond to that particular question. Well, most of the time, students will prefer a narrative to poetry. But again, I want to say if they ask you to respond to this question and examination, make sure that you are well prepared for the same. Don't assume that it is easy. Always prepare well for you to score highly. So that is it for today. If you have liked this content and you want to support us, please hit the subscription button. Also, let us know what you think about our content in the comment section below. Until next time, it is goodbye.